Shabbat Shalom. It's nice to start to recognize some of the faces. So it was over 2 decades ago. I'm pretty sure it was 1998. I was a secular young adult, a graduate student at Tel Aviv University. I went for Kabbalat Shabbat services. Well, not so secular, because I went to Kabbalat Shabbat services at Beit Daniel, the Reform Synagogue in Tel Aviv. That day, the rabbi was abroad, and the rabbinic intern got to deliver the drasha. He was a timid guy, a shy guy, so he came to the bima, and you could see that he was nervous. And he, with a lot of hesitation, he said, well, first it's an honor to address you guys as my sacred community, but I also do that with a lot of trepidation, because I think that in our parsha, God was wrong. And the parsha was Parashat Korach. If people remember their stories from the Torah, there's a rebellion against Moshe led by Korach. God opens the desert, and the desert swallows the rebels. And so that's what he was disagreeing with. And I, this young secular Jew, I was holding to my chair, expecting the floor to open and to swallow all of us. Belonging to a tradition that allowed for people to question God, even the more so someone training to become a rabbi, was new, and it changed my perspectives in so many ways. In many dimensions, I say that my path to the rabbinate became that day, started that day. The possibility of question authority, even God's authority, as kind of encoded in our tradition, was something that amazed me. This week's Parsha has some of the most famous stories that we hear in those who went to day school or in religious school or in a lot of sermons. Some of the most famous passages we hear about, as I mentioned yesterday, the 3 last, I don't like to call them plagues because they're not plagues. In Hebrew they're called makot. They're kind of blows, they're hits. So the 3 last hits by God against Pharaoh and Egypt. We also get instructions on how to observe Passover from that day on. But there's one story there that I never learned, not in day school, and I have never seen any of my students learning in religious school. And that says, in Hebrew it says, God says to Moshe, Daber na beoznei ha'am, veishalu ish me'et re'ehu, veisha me'et re'uta, klei kesef vechli za'av, vaiten Adonai et chen ha'am beinei Mitzrayim. So God says to Moshe, please speak in the ears of the people to borrow, each man from his fellow man, and each woman from her fellow woman, objects of silver and gold. And Adonai disposed Mitzrayim favorably toward the people. The same theme had been already introduced in 2 previous passages in the book of Shmot, when God told Moshe what was going to happen, and God said, the people will not leave Egypt barehanded. Traditional commentators have dealt with the difficulty of what it means to to borrow from the Egyptians things that they had no intention of returning because they were leaving Egypt, and that God predisposed the Egyptians to give it to them. The Egyptians didn't really have free will to say no, because God predisposed them to say yes. So traditional commentators did not really like criticizing neither our ancestors, much less gods, even though in the Jewish tradition, for our ancestors to disagree with God is not uncommon. When God told Abraham to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, God said, will the justice of all earth not judge this case with justice? And when God told Moshe to destroy the Israelites, Moshe answered, what will other people say? Don't do that. And our people received our name, Bnei Israel. In tradition, the name Jewish is fairly recent, maybe from the last 200, 300 years, even though it appears already in Megillat Esther, which is much older. But for most of the Talmud and the Jewish tradition, the Jewish people is called Israel, the children of Israel. And the meaning of the word Israel is the one who fights with God. So the idea of disagreeing with God is not foreign to the Jewish tradition, but the rabbis from the Talmud didn't really, well, there's a famous story in the Talmud in which also the rabbis, there's a disagreement among rabbis, and God tries to intervene, and God says, you know that this guy is always right. And the rabbis say, you gave us the Torah, now it's ours to decide. You stay in heaven. So, but the rabbis didn't really like to criticize. So they came with answers. They put the blame on the Egyptians. They said, oh, these were the Egyptians that were against Pharaoh. So they wanted to show solidarity with the Israelites. Then they gave it to them. And other medieval commentators said that the Israelites asked to borrow some simple artifacts. Rashbam said that, but the Egyptians gave them all the best that they had out of their own will. Rashi, who was the grandfather for Rashbam, Rashi said that the Israelites would come and ask for one, and he said, one, you say, I'll give you two. Right? So it was out of their own free will. Ibn Ezra attacked those questioning the honesty of the Israelites. We need to remember these are living in medieval times. The Catholic Church had a lot of power and criticized the honesty of the Jewish community based on these verses. So on the one hand, by defending the Israelites, they were also defending their own honor and honesty. So Ibn Ezra said that they were following God's orders, which should never be questioned. Remember this. They were following God's orders, which should never be questioned. God created everything and can take it from one and give it to another. There's nothing wrong in this, for everything belongs to God. And so a question I have, if we go back to the text, to the biblical text that I read to you, Daber na beoznei ha'am, please speak to the ear of the people, please whisper to the people. If there's no problem with what God is asking the Israelite to do, why is this whisper? Why is God hiding what God is asking the Israelites to do? The commentators never really addressed that. Some modern commentators have also addressed the issue. Nehama Leibovitz, one of the greatest biblical commentators in Israel in the second half of the 20th century, she argued that it would have been understandable if the Israelites, after 400 years of slavery, had taken the initiative for demanding artifacts from the Mitzrim, from the Egyptians, either as a compensation for their labor or as gifts. But the fact that God had instructed them to do so, revealing a premeditated divine plan, is the source of our discomfort. Could God have instructed the Israelites to do something ethically dubious? Beno Jacob, a German commentator who lived in the first half of the 20th century, argued that the Israelites never had the intention of misleading the Egyptians, and that the punishment of Mitzrayim was intended to teach both Egypt and Israel not to oppress the stranger. Furthermore, the gold, silver, and clothes were farewell gifts given by the Egyptians to the Israelites before the 10th plague, not because of fear of an impending death, but out of sympathy with the Israelites' suffering. Beno Jacob argues that the gift should be understood as a public protest against Pharaoh's actions, showing how the receptive hearts of the Egyptians were contrasted to the Pharaoh's hardened hearts. The people remembered Joseph's actions and were impressed by God's power through the blows when God asked Moshe to instruct the Israelites to approach Egypt. The use of the word "na," please, in God's instructions indicates God's concern that the Israelites would feel so triumphant after the killing of the firstborns that they might reject the farewell gifts offered by the Egyptians. God wanted to ensure that the Israelites and Ha'am HaMitzri, the Egyptian people, ended the episode in good terms despite the dispute with Pharaoh. So according to Beno Jacob, there was no ethical issue here because God was actually allowing the Egyptians and the Israelites to part in good terms. A similar reading was proposed by Yehuda Radai, a Bible scholar from the Technion, who was even more direct on his question. How could God have commanded them to do what was not only far from perfect, but prima facie immoral? He notes that if the articles of silver and gold were meant to be wages for the Israelites' work, they should have been demanded publicly and not a few hours before the Israelites left. His alternative interpretation is that the text includes several hints of mutual relationship between the Israelites and the Egyptians that led to an exchange of gifts at the time of departure. All God had asked from the Israelites was to accept the offer to help the Egyptians expiate their blame and shame and thus to save their land. As I said, the commentators have a problem criticizing the behavior of the Israelites, and even the more so, their request from God. I would like to propose an alternative reading inspired by what I learned by the rabbinic intern over 20 years ago. I also disagree with God's instruction to the Israelites. I believe Israel had a moral imperative of rejecting God's commands. Differently from Ibn Ezra, I think it is our religious duty to question God's commandments, a duty that derives from our creation, B'Tselem Elohim, in the divine image, with free will and the capacity to distinguish between right and wrong. God did not create automatons who blindly follow orders, but human beings who should be held accountable for their actions, even when following instructions. We Jews are called Bnei Israel, the children of the one who struggled with Elohim, an indication that Judaism is not about accepting of God's instructions without questioning them first. At least two of the leading figures of our tradition dared to challenge God: Abraham on behalf of Sodom and Gomorrah, and Moshe on behalf of the Israelites after the golden calf incident. Interestingly, though, when God asks Moshe to instruct the Israelites, the people are not called Bnei Israel, but Ha'am, the people. As a test to the people, God softly requested them to spoil Mitzrayim, and Bnei Israel failed the test. After the blow of darkness afflicted Mitzrayim, a moral darkness fell over Israel, and the people put their anger towards the Egyptians above their obligation to act ethically, stripping Egypt from valuable objects. Radai, a medieval commentator, has noted there are only 4 times in the entire Tanakh when God uses the particle na, please, when addressing human beings. 1, when Abraham and Lot departed ways. 2, when Abraham complained that he was growing old and still did not have a son. 3, when God instructed the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. And 4, when God instructed the Israelites to spoil Mitzrayim. All episodes in which God requests tasks that cannot be fully understood rationally. The Akedah especially has been often understood as a test for Abraham, one that commentators have not agreed whether he passed or not. The use of the same language in our passage corroborates the reading of these episodes as God testing the Israelites. Nahum Sarna, a contemporary biblical scholar, suggests that the articles of silver and gold the Israelites received from the Egyptians were probably used in the building of the golden calf. The implied message of one misdeed leading to another, mitzvah goredet mitzvah, a good deed leads to another, averah goredet averah, a misdeed, a bad action leads to another. It's a rabbinic concept from the Mishnah. The implied message of one misdeed leading to another can hardly be overlooked and should be read as the biblical condemnation of the Israelites' acts on plundering Mitzrayim. The Israelites certainly deserved being recompensed for the years of labor in Mitzrayim, but they did not have the right to act deceitfully to achieve that goal. Instead of openly demanding reparation from Pharaoh, they decided to take the shortcut, accepting God's offer to soften the heart of the Egyptians, while the Israelites borrowed their most valuable articles. Instead of establishing a new paradigm for the proper treatment of foreign workers in biblical times, the Israelites' attitude forever stained the Jewish people's foundational narrative. As the Dvar Torah I heard so many years ago, Parashat Bo teaches me not to settle for the plain meaning of God's words. It's not easy, but being part of the Israelite people, of the people of Israel, the people that wrestles with God, requires sometimes saying no to God. It might be regarding the proper treatment of a rebellious son, another polemical passage of Torah, of same-sex relationships, or of a patriarchal model that denies women their fair share in familial and communal leadership. The issues might be different for each one of us, but the claim of an ideological position as being the Word of God, even when there are scriptural foundations for that claim, should not imply a bypass of moral and ethical considerations. After having eaten from the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, we don't have an alternative but to make judgment calls on issues that are relevant to our hearts, and to consider not only what God demands, but also where good and evil are. I want to encourage each one of you to see Tanakh in a different way. What if instead of being the book of all answers, it became God's opening speech in a conversation we also have a saying? I now see our text as inviting my questions, challenging me to engage in the dialogue, and invite you to try and do the same. Our Parsha hints on asking as an important paradigm for living when it tells of the child who asks, "What do you mean by this right?" A question that we know from the Passover Haggadah, from the Pesach Haggadah. The rabbis label this as the wicked child, but the Torah is actually very compassionate in the answer this child receives. Let's take asking from the Haggadah and from the Seder into the world. May we all be blessed with the wisdom, compassion, and sense of justice to pass all of God's tests, even when it requires taking bold theological stances. Shabbat Shalom.